So I felt like this would be something fun to do and something a little different to record with my good pal Aubrey on the recent nodal shifts in Pisces and Virgo from Aries and Libra. Um, Aubrey and I were both going to write about this separately, and then just felt like, why wouldn't we record and yap away like we always love to do? So.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think for the purposes of this, we wanted to give our perspective of what we believe the nodes in Pisces and Virgo might bring, the types of behaviors we might see. We did a little research on social media and how there was some landscape changing there. So that will definitely be a part of the talk. But maybe it's best to let Aubrey start and give some perspective on I guess, when was the last time the North Node was in Pisces? And like, how do you perceive a North Node in Pisces and South Node in Virgo?
Okay, sure. First of all, I'm so excited to be here. I love you. Obviously, I love when
You
we
too.
chat away about everything, which is what we do pretty much every day. And yes, as I said, this is perfect. Anthony literally texted me when I was trying to sit down at my laptop to write a Substack post about the nodes. And he's like, "What if we talked about it instead?" And I was like, "Great, let's do it." Um, so the last time that we had the North Node in Pisces and South Node in Virgo was from, I think it's June 20th, 2006 until January 7th, 2008. So for those who don't know, the nodes are in a set of signs for about 18 months. So it's a year and a half every time. Um, I personally, and this is something that Anthony and I have talked about, and I'm going to say it and he's going to say no, and that's fine, but that's why we're here. Um, I find the implications of the North Node in Pisces and South Node in Virgo to be very interesting because I once read a theory that these are the home signs of the nodes, whereas Anthony has a different opinion, and we'll talk about that in a minute, or maybe we should talk about that now, and then we'll go on.
So I will say in my studies, I have seen that the North Node in Gemini is like the correct placement, quote unquote, of the North Node, and the South Node in Sagittarius is the quote correct placement. And I actually think that's based on Vedic and medieval tradition, but I could be wrong. I
Yeah,
read it somewhere.
I read Pisces Virgo in Vedic astrology too. So who knows, right? What I think is interesting, no matter what, is the theory. Both theories point to mutable signs, right,
Mhm.
as sort of being the natural positions of the nodes. So obviously, being on a mutable axis is very different than being on the cardinal axis that we just were on and have now moved off of. I always say I think the beauty of the mutable signs and the gift that they give us is the lesson of flexibility, adaptability, having open minds and open hearts, and sort of recognizing that there are multiple truths, right? Multiple perspectives and experiences, and they're all valid, right? I'll put a little asterisk there, but they're all valid, right, for the most part. And there is something, of course, about being open to the different perspectives and experiences, and sort of the diversity that life has to offer, right? I always think of that saying, variety is the spice of life. And I think mutable signs really embody that more than any of the other signs.
Mhm. I don't disagree. Obviously, as a mutable sun, I love variety. It's like my favorite thing in the world. Yeah, I think this is going to be a very different experience from us from what we've had in the last couple of years. But I also think there's a story that's unfolding that's related to the last couple of years as well. And the reason why I bring this up is because we've recently had, and we've continued to have Saturn in Pisces, right? And as we kind of enter this space, the North Node in Pisces is going to cover ground that Saturn hasn't covered yet.
Mhm.
And then it will backtrack over ground that Saturn has covered. So that tells me that the first part of the North Node in Pisces, there's an expansive quality to it that Saturn will come in and ground, but also maybe redirect or restructure. And then what Saturn has already worked on through Pisces, when the North Node hits that point and goes back over, that there will be growth periods from that too. I think maybe it's also best to back up and take a closer look at the um, ideas, archetypes, and maybe the key phrases or words around Virgo and Pisces too, for people who maybe are unfamiliar or, maybe need a little bit extra information. So Pisces is often attributed to, I think, the phrase "I believe,"
Mm.
right? So there's this sense of like faith and trust, whereas Virgo is often attributed to "I analyze." So there's like a factual component to Virgo
Mhm.
that comes up. So with the South Node in Virgo, from my perspective, I think gifts that we have or that we can discover during this time would be understanding maybe organization a little differently, being able to know our limits, being able to understand boundaries, like when we can say no. I also think that there will be a pretty big emphasis being put on health and well-being.
Mhm.
We're seeing this already, it, both for good and bad, I should say. Right. We have like the Make America Healthy Again, which feels very Virgo Pisces in the sense of like it's wellness, Virgo, but like with some delusion, Pisces. And then we're also seeing health come up around like healthcare, right?
Mhm.
And like healthcare industries. And we have to understand Virgo rules labor and organizations. So the organizations around health are being scrutinized and discriminized and
Mhm.
analyzed in some ways, which all feels very South Node in Virgo. Plus, reproductive health, trans health, women's health, all of these things are going to continue to prove to be important or come up in conversation over the next 2 years, 18 months, 2 years, while the South Node is in Virgo. Um, the things that we also have to work through, I guess, with the South Node in Virgo is like perfectionism,
Yeah.
control, criticism, discrimination, and judgment, right? Could be as well like fears of making a mistake or fears of doing something wrong. Could also being struggling with what we believe in can come up too. Maybe people will be having a shift in faith overall, especially as the North Node in Pisces tends to want us to seek out more,
Mhm.
we're craving to put more trust in something that's bigger than ourselves. I think too, the North Node in Pisces, some of the hallmarks that we can learn are like forgiveness, compassion, introspection, right? Progress versus perfection, divine timing versus like actual timing being something that comes up, not needing to know the why or how behind something, and understanding how belief is a part of making decisions, right? Because the Virgo can be very decisive and it looks at the facts and figures, but there's also gut-based decision making that I think that Pisces has a really good connection to the spirit, healing arts, things like that will come up. What's your perspective on the kind of the node, South Node Virgo, North Node
Yeah, I
Pisces?
mean, I share all of those same things, right? When I think of Pisces, I think of Pisces as being one of the most creative signs, certainly within the zodiac, and sort of ruling over, I'll say, the umbrella of the arts, right? So creativity and art in all of its forms, drawing, painting, acting, singing, dancing, the whole thing, right? Pisces has an incredibly like vast and rich and powerful imagination. And perhaps there's something about learning to value our imagination more. Pisces rolling over like dreaming as well. Could we see a resurgence along like dream work and the psychology field and all of that? Totally. Which also feels very like Virgo Pisces. We're analyzing, doing dream work. It feels very Jungian, I will say. I also tend to think of Pisces, yeah, it's like I mean, inevitably, I think of like spirituality, religion, faith, all of the
Mhm.
cults, all of those things, especially when we think of the sort of like delusion, right, that can come along with Pisces. I do think there's a question around the line, right, around
Mhm.
like what we believe in and where does it bleed over into delusion versus like faith, and what is the relationship, right, between all of those things. And certainly with the Pisces Virgo axis, I also think of the tangible versus the intangible,
Mhm.
right? And I also think of the axis of service and sacrifice when
Mhm.
thinking about Virgo and Pisces as well. I think what Virgo and Pisces have in common is that idea around sacrifice and service, and they both do it, right? They maybe do it in different ways, but they are both doing it. And I think, of course, what's always interesting to me, I'll say about this axis, is that sort of sacrificial love is not something that is idealized in our society and isn't a form of love that tends to be valued, romanticized, all of that, but arguably is sort of like a very evolved version of love and a very important version of love. Um, because you do at certain points in your life, right? Like you sort of set your own needs or wants or whatever aside in order to show up to something bigger, Pisces, right, outside of yourself, and to act in service of that to someone else. So
I
that's
love
my
that.
thought.
I think this idea of sacrifice and service, I think is really beautiful. I think it also brings in the idea of surrender, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think of because there's also this sense of like, what can I not control? South Node and Virgo, like what can I no longer control? And what can I learn to surrender to? But maybe what do I not have to sacrifice in order to surrender either? Because sacrifice, although can be noble, right, there's also a martyrdom that
Yeah,
sometimes can exist within this axis as well of, well, look what I've done, right? Look what I've given you, or something like that. Look what I've had to sacrifice to make your life better, to make something greater for you.
I completely agree with that.
And I also think too, I love what you said about there being this greater sense of love, because then I also think, obviously Pisces has that deep connection to compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And without being able to control something, we can still love it oh so deeply and oh so intensely, right?
Yeah.
I think too, where the South Node in Virgo can have us feeling trapped is in our own head, right? Like anxious attachment, anxious thoughts, but also with grudges that we've been holding. So something I attribute often to this axis is this idea of closure. If you
Mm-hmm.
think about, Virgo wants to see things tied up and put away neatly in a box, and Pisces is a lot more liminal and open, but it's also the last sign of the zodiac. So there is a sense of closure and rebirth that comes from that, which tells me that this period will also be a time of closure collectively and individually. And in order to have closure, you have to be able to understand forgiveness and not always forgiving another person for harming you, but sometimes forgiving yourself for criticizing yourself for putting yourself in a situation that maybe wasn't the best, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it maybe was out of your control. Again, going back to this idea that we have to surrender to the idea that maybe you didn't have the choice and you can still
Yeah.
forgive yourself.
Yeah, I
So,
totally agree with you. Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's what I've been telling people too, is like Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. Like we are working through endings in some way. I also think that lines up interestingly with the major astrology of 2025. We're seeing all of the outer planets like shifting into a new
mhm,
sign temporarily, and then going back, because there is like on a larger scale that sense of like, hey, we're closing out all of these chapters that we've been going through for a long time, right? Like we just did it with Pluto in Capricorn, and now it's into Aquarius, and that's fine. We're going to deal with Neptune temporarily entering Aries, the same deal with Saturn, and Uranus temporarily entering Gemini. So we have those
mhm.
kind of like longer scale transits that are ending and beginning. Love that.
Mm. It makes me think a little bit too as like a almost like a side note. And I don't know why this even comes to mind, but in maybe it's the idea of ending and beginning, I have no idea. But there's this sense of with the South Node in Virgo, because it's kind of related to labor, right? there's this narrative that we have in our head that we have to work really hard for something. And maybe this also, we've had a lot of water and earth signs in the outer generational planets. So I think this kind of plays along with this. Maybe that's where my brain went. But because there's this sense of labor and we feel like we have to work really hard for something, then we think that everything in life must be earned, right? And that is absolutely a narrative in Western United States American society, right? Or thought process. And if you think about Virgo, it's in fall, Venus is in fall in Virgo, right? So if we think about the attributes of Venus being love, values, worthiness, right? There's this sense of like those things have to be earned instead of inherently given. Whereas like Pisces to me, maybe it isn't about things that are labored, right? But maybe things, it's about understanding, and it tends to have a connection to things that, you know, or maybe acceptance, and maybe we don't always have an understanding in order to accept, or we have to learn to not have an understanding in order to accept. Compassion doesn't require comprehension. I listened to a really amazing talk by Alok, and they kind of brought this up in one of their chats, and it's always sat with me that comprehension doesn't actually mean, right, care. It just means you can have compassion anyways. And I think Pisces is a beautiful reminder that thinking about the exaltation of Venus, right, happening in Pisces, which is more universal, more open, more whimsical, more romantic in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. And, you know, self-acceptance and love is not something that can necessarily be earned. So I think we're going to be pushed up against the idea of, you know, what can we earn and what is something that we cannot earn, but we have to learn to accept or love as it is.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. You know, obviously, I view Pisces as being this very soft sign, right?
Hmm.
Thinking about Venus and its exaltation, Neptune is a higher octave of Venus, right? And the modern day ruler of Pisces. That is something that I've been thinking about in relation to the nodes, is like, because I do kind of think of Virgos being very sharp,
Hmm.
right? Because it can be very critical of others, very critical of the self,
Hmm.
right? And even though Virgo means well, their delivery is not always tactile, I will say.
Hmm.
Whereas Pisces is like almost impossibly soft, right? Like they have this sort of endless well of like compassion and understanding. And in my opinion, they truly embody that idea of unconditional love, right? In the
Hmm.
way that the rest of us could probably stand to take a book, a page out of their book, right? And so I just thinking about it on both an individual and this kind of collective scale. You know, hopefully we see this kind of shift towards greater compassion, understanding, love, acceptance, all of those things. And as you and I sort of touched on a while ago, I do think we'll also see this emergence around nuance, right?
Hmm.
And blending of things, right? And having to have acceptance around that as well.
I think that's a beautiful point. If you think about Virgo being sometimes black and white, right? It's a yes or no answer. It's the facts and figures. Pisces exists in the in-between. It's the inhalations and the exhalations we make on the words that we speak. And I think that Pisces is a reminder that yes, nuance is important, that not all things can be black and white or facts and figures. We're seeing that on the political spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
People crossing political boundaries, especially with healthcare, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the Luigi Mangione thing. People from the right are in agreement with people on the left over, you know, what has happened. And I think too, the nuance continues to expand as we maybe put ourselves or we find ourselves in positions with people that we don't always agree with, right? And I'm not saying you need to befriend anyone that you don't agree with, and I'm not saying compromise your values, but there could be something around common ground that starts to come up where we help soften other people's viewpoints of the black and white that, oh, it's only this way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And through interaction and through conversation, which feels very mercurial, right? Very South Node and Virgo, you know, we can start to expand our belief systems, our value systems, and our minds, which also feels very Jupiter, very Pisces in some ways too. I think we are going to realize that because of the immense division, which feels again very Virgo, but also Pisces duality, right? The immense division, the only time or way that we can come together is somewhere in between, somewhere in the middle, where we are like, okay, I believe in this thing so strongly, and I want to have a conversation about it and see if we can meet. And it can even
Mhm.
happen relationally. I'm not even talking politically, right? This can happen in relation. This can happen at work. This can happen with strangers. It doesn't matter, right? It's about knowing where you can meet people and going back to
Mhm.
Pisces compassion, trying to lead with compassion more than anything else.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And in that sense, I actually think that like the role that transiting Jupiter is playing throughout the transits of the nodes in Virgo and Pisces is a very interesting one too, and is actually something that's kind of been on my radar because we're sort of starting out this transit with Jupiter and Gemini, right?
Mhm.
So Jupiter as the traditional ruler of Pisces and therefore the traditional ruler of the North Node in Pisces. But Jupiter is sort of embodying that same mercurial energy being in Gemini, right? And is in its fall. And so to me, that feels like a bridge, right,
Mhm.
between the North and South Node. And Jupiter really already priming us for that because it's been in Gemini for a while,
Mhm.
right? And is sort of taking over, I'll call it the first third of this transit in Pisces and Virgo. So, I've already seen calls from people online talking about like we need more nuance and it can't just be this kind of like heavily divided yes or no one or the other type of approach to things because it's really not how life happens, right? Like
Mhm.
life really does kind of happen in the in between and in these varying shades, and if we can't acknowledge that right, and sort of have the compassion and the humanity around that, Pisces, we're not going to make any progress. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
I absolutely, obviously agree with you. And I think too, I love that you bring up Jupiter and Gemini because it also has me thinking about. So we start with squares between the nodes with Jupiter, which is the ruler of the North Node, and then we enter sextiles and trines,
Mhm.
right? When Jupiter enters Cancer in the back half of the year, and the
Mhm.
relationship that it's going to have with the North Node in particular as it trines it. So, whatever sort of feels like a struggle or an obstacle in the beginning part of the nodal experience then becomes eased. And maybe we don't even recognize the shift or the comfort or the ease, and we might even take it for granted too. So, I think there's something to call attention to. And then I'm also wondering too, with like Virgo, Pisces, are there shifts to like workers' rights that might come
Mhm.
up, right?
Mhm.
Um, are there changes to like humanitarian efforts as well, or like land related efforts? I'm thinking about like Virgo having that tending to the land and Pisces being a humanitarian in some ways. I think at its best, we can find ourselves wanting to make things feel more humane, right? That
Yeah.
feels very Pisces Virgo to me. We want to fix too. That's probably not always at the best, but we want to fix a situation.
Mhm.
And so maybe also knowing our limits. This is the South Node in Virgo being able to grant us the idea of boundaries. So that
Yeah.
way we don't become so dissolved in someone else's situation that we completely ignore, uh, our needs as well.
Mhm. I totally agree with that.
So, um, So Pisces and Virgo, I guess archetypally, we have a better understanding of like what we might be able to see or experience. But maybe, from a more pop culture perspective or social media perspective, there's also this interesting thing coming up where I think you and I have discovered this last night. Facebook was launched more, like, I'm going to put globally in quotes, but it was launched to the public um, right around the time the nodes were in Pisces and Virgo, right?
Mhm.
And so it'll be interesting to see what changes specifically with Meta. And we have the
Mhm.
TikTok ban coming, right? through the Pisces Virgo eclipses. The other thing too is that Instagram was launched in a Venus retrograde, and we're upcoming a Venus retrograde that's going to move through the degrees of some of the Pisces North Node, but also some of the Aries North Node. So kind of the liminal space that we've been in maybe since like October or September of last year up until I would say like maybe March or April of this year, when maybe even a little bit further when the nodes get to about 24 degrees Pisces. So I think from a social media perspective, we're going to see a lot of shifting, maybe some backtracking for Meta in particular,
Mhm.
and maybe needing to reevaluate why they've come out and had a certain stance, or the owner of Meta has had a certain stance that is unfavorable, clearly, right? What are your thoughts on Meta and these nodes in particular?
Well, it's everything we talked about last night, right? Like
Yeah.
Instagram itself was launched during a Venus retrograde, which of course you and I found very interesting. And so, very recent, like Facebook, okay, Facebook has been in like a weird place for
Hmm.
a long time, I feel. I haven't been on Facebook for years, so like I truly have no idea. But every now and then I'll see people kind of complaining about Facebook over on threads being like, oh, it's just all like AI and ads, and it's impossible to like find people on there, and you never see their statuses and their posts or whatever anymore. And it's just sort of become like inundated, I guess, with yeah, like AI and ads, and like it sounds like a nightmare. Like I'm kind of like, why are people still over there, right? But and then Instagram being launched during a Venus retrograde, I think is so curious. But obviously Zuckerberg just came out and was like, "Oh, we're getting rid of our fact checkers, and we're
Hmm.
forget what else he said they were doing." But there's obviously been a huge pushback on that, on the fact checking in particular, which feels very like Virgo Pisces, right? And him being like, oh, people have been saying the fact checkers are biased. And it's like, well, if they're humans, then of course human error is going to be in there. Okay. But like facts are not, they're inherently not biased, right? They're
Right.
just true. And so, which is very Virgo, right? Like it's either this or it's
Hmm.
that. It's either true or it's not. And him moving away from that, which feels like South Node in Virgo, North, and moving towards something that's maybe a little more Delulu, right? North Node in Pisces. But so we'll see what happens, and if there is a rescinding of some of these policies that he
Hmm.
claims to launch during Venus retrograde or not. And of course, the other
Hmm.
place that my mind goes, which you can tell me if you agree with this or not, is that Saturn will eventually be there,
Yeah.
right? And so whatever is being sort of like initiated
Hmm.
or whatever during this Venus retrograde, like Saturn's going to come back and activate those degrees. So will Neptune, I guess. And so I don't think we'll be like done with it.
No. We may not be for a while. It's funny you're bringing up like Facebook, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's a place of misinformation, but it's also a place of
Mhm.
siloing people in their areas of beliefs. The algorithm, right, silos people based on their interests, which feels very Virgo. So we have to understand, Facebook when it was opened to the public, um, the nodes Virgo Pisces, right? So we have this like that we have this segmentation of people happening, and then all we're being inundated with AI and ads and fake things, right? Which feels very Pisces as well. Then the fact checking going away also feels very Virgo Pisces too. Another company that publicly launched in 2006 around the time of the Virgo Pisces nodes would be Twitter,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
And so there being a shift or a change in X or Twitter. I'm going to dead name it. Sorry. Uh, but or seeing how maybe either Meta is going to follow in the footsteps of Twitter too, because they both share the same nodal return. we have to remember nodal returns are really pivotal in a chart. So
Mhm.
it speaks to a major change that comes through in someone's life or an event overall. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on Twitter?
I mean, I'm very curious to see what happens with Twitter moving forward because there's been this like building conversation around like, oh, Elon's driven it into the ground. There's been this like mass exodus also where people have been deleting their Twitter accounts and popping over to Threads, for example. But as we have kind of discussed off and on, when we see this mass exodus of people from one side or the other, it then creates this vacuum, yes, where it's like who comes in to replace that is just
Hmm.
one group of people. So we see Twitter morphing into this very like alt-right weirdo place. And so as I mean, yes, you sort of can't overstate the importance of a nodal return. And so we'll see what happens with Twitter if it just dissolves, right? Like Pisces that just sort of ceases to exist, or like what happens. But yes, there is that kind of interesting parallel between um, Meta and Twitter. Um, I don't know. I don't know. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think too. It's funny you were talking about as a complete side note. I was thinking about this. I was like, oh, I think I got rid of my Facebook during the North Node in Virgo.
Oh, really?
Last time North Node is in Virgo, which is like the nodal opposition of,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I feel like there was an exodus that happened during that time of people of a specific age from Facebook onto
Actually, I
Instagram.
think that's when I got rid of mine too.
Yeah,
When was that?
right.
2012?
No, the North Node in Virgo would have been like 2016, 2015.
No, I got rid of mine before then. Okay.
Yeah, I got rid of mine in like 2015. And I feel like obviously Instagram was around and people were already there, but I think there was more of an exodus that happened. So it's interesting now that we're seeing an exodus starting to occur on the meta platforms too, right? I think that's kind of where my brain was going with this.
But you're right about that. And actually, I love what you said about people of a certain age because that is what happened. Like our kind of like millennial group at a certain point, we all were just kind of like, yeah, Facebook, like whatever. And we all went over to Instagram, LOL.
Hmm.
And now the people that are on Facebook are boomers,
Hmm.
right? Um, my dad is on there. I mean, Jennifer's on there. Like it's his generation and older
Hmm.
that sort of like stayed on Facebook for some reason. And actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, I do think the nodal opposition is when I left because
Hmm.
I was with Keith. So yeah, that would have been
Hmm.
during that time. So, anyways, we all left. We all went to Instagram.
Hmm.
Now there's this kind of like sense, and there has been a sense for, I would say, a year or so that Instagram is quote dying, right? Kind
Hmm.
of in the way that Facebook died. And with this sort of looming TikTok ban, the reaction to that has been this large call for people to boycott Meta,
Hmm.
right? And to uninstall all of their platforms from your phone and to like not be on there from whatever, the 19th, which is when it's getting banned, till I've seen March, I've seen the 26th of January, I've
Hmm.
seen whatever, right? Um, so we'll see what happens. But actually, on that note, that is the other narrative that I have seen emerging with people is like, okay, we're all sitting around feeling some type of way about like certain systems and things, but there's no actual organization that happens for people to like
Hmm.
protest or do things. And there's not like the action, the follow through behind the
Hmm.
sentiment. And it just made me think of what you said about like the South Node and Virgo being like organization and needing new
Hmm.
ways to organize and things. So we'll
Hmm.
see.
Well, you also bring up a good point. TikTok goes away. I mentioned Virgo has a connection to labor. There are people who labor on these platforms, right? It is their livelihood. It is how they make a living. It is how they pay their bills, right? It is their sense of labor. And of course, through the guise of like illusion, Pisces, North Node, when it goes away, what there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be out of jobs, right? Or they're going to have to find alternatives or think about things differently or seek out other resources or other forms of labor. And it might be difficult to re-enter certain types of labor forces, right? Or places after having experienced your working life on a content creation or a social media platform.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. And that's the other thing that I've been thinking about too is like the economic implications of a
Hmm.
TikTok going away, which is why I think it will come back
Hmm.
and under a different form. And I don't think it will be as popular as it was before, but it doesn't matter. That's a whole other conversation. But that is what I've thought about because there are so, and I've seen so many people on TikTok talking about exactly that, right? They're like, this is my livelihood. This is my full-time job. This is where every shred of my revenue comes from. And
Hmm.
how terrifying, like regardless of what you think of social media, like it is scary to be like, I'm losing my full-time job through something
Hmm.
that is completely outside of my control. Pisces,
Hmm.
Virgo, right?
Hmm.
Um, and what that will mean, because the other thing is like, there's so much money that is tied up in social media in general, right? But TikTok in particular, and TikTok sort of being touted as having a more accessible form of monetization, right? And than some of the other platforms. And you think about it, like you have all these people making all this money, thousands and thousands of dollars off of
Hmm.
TikTok, and then they turn around and spend that money in our economy. And so
Hmm.
then all of a sudden you have, is it millions of dollars? Probably that like evaporate from the economy basically with TikTok going away and what that means then for the economy at
Right.
large.
So this is what I was saying too about like labor kind of having an overhaul during this time, maybe even labor laws having an overhaul as well. Content creation maybe getting more regulated or maybe dysregulated with Pisces, right? Maybe we aren't organizing, maybe we aren't making laws, maybe we're like, whatever, it's no man's land.
Yeah,
Um,
I can see
you know, I
that.
was I'm also continuing to look at like other platforms that were launched around 2006, 2007. Spotify is another,
Okay,
right? They recently just had a lot of backlash with their Spotify Wrapped too.
interesting.
Hmm. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any changes that Spotify will also make in this
I've seen a lot
upcoming.
of people. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that
Yeah,
it
go
just
for it.
reminds me that I've seen a lot of people talking about like getting rid of their Spotify accounts too, because of their
Hmm.
like, oh my gosh, okay.
So there are a lot of companies that are going through their nodal returns or have just gone through their nodal returns. Because if it was early 2006, it was still the previous nodal. It was Aries Libra, but it's still within that same time frame, and the eclipses were still happening, right?
Mhm,
Pisces, Virgo being a part of that. And then I think one of the other things we saw was the iPhone was launched in
mhm,
2006,
mhm.
right?
So that's so interesting to me. And actually, what is really interesting to me about what we've sort of been discovering, because in my mind, when I think of like social media, new technology, and all that, I'm like Aquarius,
iPhone.
Aquarius, Aquarius, right? But it turns out it's actually like Pisces, Pisces, Pisces. Um, and so, and at, but like in that same vein, we're now seeing the emergence of all of these other social media platforms kind of coming
Hmm.
into prominence, right? We're seeing Red Note and we're seeing, oh my God, what are the other ones that we named last night? Blue Sky
Hmm.
and Neptune, literally Neptune, LOL. And yeah, so it's just very interesting because then we'll have that same pattern repeating itself around like social media apps going through their next nodal return, 18 years from now or whatever. But
Hmm.
anyways, or in this kind of same liminal space of like the transition between Aries North Node and Pisces North Node. We're gonna literally we have the same repeat going on. Oh my God, I totally lost my train of thought where I was going.
Social media,
Anyway,
Pisces, iPhone.
oh, the iPhone. Oh my God, the iPhone. Okay. So, what do you think about that? Because then we're having the nodal return of the iPhone, which
Uh-huh.
is like probably the most popular smartphone that's out there.
Well, especially in the US, right? I know outside of the US, it's not necessarily super popular because it's expensive, but definitely within the US and maybe arguably North America, but definitely in the US and Asia. I would say, I think there will be change. I would like to see changes to, I guess I should say, the iPhone in some ways. I think Apple itself is going to really have to think differently about their bread and butter product, right? Because that's really what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting because I think what you were getting at is that the iPhone was one of the first smartphones. It paved the way and made social media in our hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we could scroll and look through and discuss and chat and all these different things. Everything became even more instantaneous. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up with the iPhone, and of course, as a result, social media, or maybe social media and then resulting to differences in the iPhone. I'm also looking, Tumblr was created in February 2007, which was during the Pisces Virgo eclipses. I was a Tumblr girl,
Oh
you
my
know?
God, same. I loved Tumblr by.
Right. And I mean, Tumblr is so Pisces coded, it's dumb.
Mhm. No, I completely agree. And
It,
actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I do feel like social media as a whole is very Pisces coded. As you were kind of saying earlier, with like the curation and the like fantasy element, right, of
Mhm.
social media, because undeniably that element is so prevalent in social media. Everyone curates
Mhm.
their feed, and everything that we see on social media is this like highlight reel, right, of people's lives. And it makes it seem like our lives are one way, the fantasy, right? The
Right.
illusion of social media, and the reality does not very often match up with what is presented on social media, which is obviously a critique that we see a lot with social media as well.
So I'm going to add to that and say that the South Node in Virgo being that perfection, right? And like the pining for the perfection of the fantasy. I just looked, TikTok was released in September 2016, which was the North Node in Virgo, South Node in Pisces around eclipse season. So it's in its nodal opposition.
Yes. So that's very interesting too, because the other thing that people often say is that TikTok is different from other social media platforms
It's
because it
real.
is just people in their real life. Yeah. Like people literally just film themselves yapping, North Node and Virgo, right? About whatever. And that, yeah, it's like
Hmm.
way more. So that's funny.
Well, and you have to understand all these other social media platforms that we just talked about were in their nodal opposition at the time that TikTok was
Mm-hmm.
launched.
Mm-hmm.
So it came through not just even as something different, but almost like as a dark horse,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Totally.
Which it's kind of, and it's done that.
And it
So
is.
during the nodal squares to all of them, which was 2020, 2021, we saw social media pop off in a very different way, obviously, because a lot of us were stuck at home during the pandemic, but specifically TikTok, right? Like expanded exponentially during the North Node, Gemini, South Node, in
Yeah.
Sagittarius, right? And I think it was kind of from that point too that Meta started to compete very heavily and then was looking to take it down, or just other social media channels in general were looking to take it down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting now that TikTok is in its nodal opposition and Meta is in its around its nodal return, that TikTok is potentially getting banned, right? And like Meta is trying to figure out how to absorb that space.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and Elon is talking about potentially buying TikTok and all this stuff.
I've heard that's been debunked, but I mean, even if
Well, I
it's
hope that's true. I mean, he like the thing is ByteDance as the mother company, right, of TikTok.
Mhm,
Um, Nobody really gets to decide whether or not they're going to sell besides ByteDance. So
mhm.
people can say what they want, but okay.
Yeah,
Out of curiosity, when was Snapchat launched?
let's look that up. I'm like, what is Snapchat? Snapchat release date 2011. So it is a North node in Sag, South node in Gemini. So it's also mutable nodes. Hmm.
Clearing, clearing the nodes. Okay. Interesting. There's something about, yeah, the mutable nodes in social media. Okay.
Hmm.
And actually, what's interesting about that too, with it having its nodes squaring all of the other ones we just discussed, is all of the social media, literally every single social media platform took the Snapchat story idea, right? Where you post for 24 hours
Hmm.
and then it's gone. Every platform does that now.
Hmm. Hmm.
Interesting. Influence of Snapchat
And
if
of course,
it's
and of course, it's like different, right? So it does its own thing anyway. Um, Yeah, that is interesting, actually. I'm also thinking a little bit about social, like the banning of TikTok and then the idea of limiting free speech, or like getting rid of people's ability to express themselves, which also kind of feels Virgo Pisces in some way
Mhm.
too, right? Like Mercury, that idea of like I want to share, I want to speak, I want to talk, I want to give in some way.
Mhm.
So I think too, like there's this connection to the rules sometimes with Virgo Pisces and like being able to like defy the rules or really rewrite the rules. So we have to kind of expand beyond the rules that are set in place, break the rules to make our own. I also see this a lot with Aquarius Leo, which is where the nodes are headed next anyway. So it's kind of like a premonition of what we might see in
I
some of
agree.
that space
You know, I
personally.
agree.
I know you agree. Uh, but yeah, so I think, you know, we spent all this time talking about social media, but it's like insane to think about how the nodes are really going to be impacting that space in particular.
I
Hmm.
agree. Completely agree. Um, okay, to pivot from
Okay.
this. I'm also curious, like, what else you think we're going to see the rise of on this kind of like pop culture, social level? Because as we were kind of talking about before we started recording this, the last time that we had the North Node in Pisces was like the peak, the pinnacle of like emo and scene and all of that,
Hmm.
like emerging. And you think of the way that people were like dressing and the fashion and the way they did their hair, which was always full of like funky colors and like it feels very like Pisces Aquarius also, right? Thinking about the way that people were styling themselves. And of course, I think that we're going to see a resurgence around film, right?
Hmm.
Like I think of, and especially like art housey, very like
Hmm. Hmm.
beautiful, well done film. I'm going to reference Nosferatu. Nosferatu is like a good example, just because everyone's talking about it right now, and everyone's talking about how stunning it is. Right? Everyone's like, oh my God, the color palettes. Oh my God, the visuals. Oh my God, the music. And that all feels very Pisces to me. Right? And when we think about perhaps moving away from the mercurial energy of Virgo, that's like, I'm going to say these words. And we're
Hmm.
moving more to this very kind of like abstract. I think of Pisces as being mute in Mercury, right? And so we think of
Hmm.
abstract visual elements of Pisces that are like, I'm not going to say it, I'm going to show it.
I
Does
love
that make
that.
sense?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Snaps for you on that one. I think that is brilliant and really insightful. I hadn't really thought about film in particular. I actually, my brain was going like photography film.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
like, right. And like, there's something, but even like, I guess, movie film, there's something both tactile and not tactile about film, which feels very Pisces Virgo axis. I think music obviously is going to have a pretty much a shift. I wouldn't be surprised if we come back to some emo-esque or other things that dominated like that time frame. I'm thinking, you know, like singer-songwriter and like the Fiona Apples and you know,
Oh my
like
God.
Regina Spektor and like all of those
Yeah. The
artists
like bulky. Yeah.
and like kind of bringing some of that back in a resurgence. It would be interesting to you had said something. Oh, counterculture is something else that kind of came to mind where you know as an act of resistance to things to systems that are being put into place a counterculture is obviously going to emerge and this feels very north node pisces entering also going into the north node in aquarius. I was pulling the astrology of 2026 just looking ahead and we have our first solar eclipse in aquarius in 2026 in february. So there's going to be we're going to have a crossover year again where we have like we're and it's like the changing of the guard like we had last
Mhm.
year.
Mhm.
So that narrative around counterculture is going to be really, really strong. And of course, the North Node is going to be entering at that point the realm of Pluto, where Pluto is currently. So I'd be curious to see what comes from that. But yeah, I think with the North Node in Pisces, I do think art and film and music is going to have a bit of a change. It's going to feel maybe a bit more glamorous, or maybe you're right, more mute, or more instrumental, or more emotional, or more sensitive in some ways. But I also think there's going to be something about the quality that's going to set it apart too, that which feels very Virgo South Node. There's going to be
Mhm.
a lot of emphasis in the details that make a difference in the big picture too.
Yeah. And I feel like, yeah, Nosferatu, I'm gonna point to again, right? Where people are like, oh my God, like I said, like the color palette and the blah, and
Mhm.
here's all the details that Robert Eggers like put in this movie that is like elevating it, right, to this like new level. So yeah, I think it will be interesting. And I've seen people talking a lot about films that they know are coming out that they're really looking forward to as well. So yeah, I
Mhm.
think there's like this resurgence and this like interest around those things. And I agree with you with the glamour. Of course, I always think of, um, you know, celebrities because we can all know them and point to them, that have that very kind of like Neptunian,
Mhm.
Piscean like element to them. Like I'm always going to point to both Marilyn Monroe and Kim Kardashian, who have Neptune on the ascendant,
Mm.
right? And so Marilyn Monroe, as like still to this day, like considered to be one of the most like glamorous people of all time, right?
Mhm.
And like her whole element or her whole cult of personality, right, was this fantasy that she represented to men and women, right? And of course, that fantasy and sort of illusion not matching up with like how she really was as a person and her dying from drugs and blah blah blah, right? But
Mhm.
like, there's also this famous interview involving her. Where she's being interviewed by someone, and she says, "Do you want to see me become her?" And she like
Mm.
does something to like turn on the Marilyn Monroe personality. And the journalist, sort of notes that like prior to her turning it on, no one was really looking their way, and she, like wasn't all done up and whatever. And then she just does something while they're like walking out in public on the street, and then all of a sudden people start like turning their heads and looking at her and blah blah blah. And it just feels very Piscean, right? Very Neptunian. And then, of course, Kim Kardashian also having Neptune on the ascendant, and her whole thing is this sort of like
Mhm.
fantasy, unrealistic, but again, sort of like idealized body and look and whatever. And it's all, of course, through like surgery and blah, 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 right? It's not like real, quote unquote. Um, but
Well,
also inevitably influencing the standards of beauty for so long, right?
so
Same with
I was going to say the other person that you made me think of when they turn it on and turn it off is Paris Hilton, and she also has Neptune on the ascendant. Yes.
Paris is another fantastic example.
And of course, like this is going to be interesting. Paris Hilton is a North Node in Leo, so she'll hit her nodal opposition in the next cycle, but her Mars is in Pisces. So
Really?
yeah, so seeing how like what comes up for her. I know 2006 was like she went to jail and then like got out, right?
Yeah.
But then like recently she was in front of court, right? Like giving
Mm-hmm.
appeals and like asking for help. And um, in particular, the other thing that you made me think of, and I noted this when I recently did a Venus retrograde panel with B and Abigail. Abigail's the Keen Witch. The There's something about aging that is starting to shift in our culture and society as well. So the Venus
Mm-hmm.
retrograde, I felt like might bring up something around aging and then also body enhancements that we're starting to notice, which also feels very Virgo Pisces nodes, right?
Mm-hmm.
I noted in 1993, during a Venus retrograde Aries cycle, or that year was a Venus retrograde in Aries, heroin chic became really big. And one of the things that we're starting to see is kind of something similar. But in 2017, when we had a Venus retrograde in Aries, it was all about body positivity. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's going to be that push and pull between the two that are going to happen over the next while with the nodes in Virgo and Pisces. But also, we're seeing a lot of films and a lot of things come out, or actresses and actors talking about aging, and then the films being a commentary on aging. I haven't seen the substance, but I think like the concept of that feels very like substances are ruled by
Mm-hmm.
Pisces. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and then the idea of aging with Pisces being the last sign of the zodiac, and like we know no age, right? We just continue to ascend beyond age. And how does someone like how do we introduce beauty standards that allow us to accept aging as it is? And not even aging gracefully, but like, showing a wrinkle on the face shows that you've had experience, and Pisces is all about experience. It shows that you've had labor. in your life. That's very Virgo South Node, too. I'm also thinking about some of the other actresses who've had some redemption lately, is like
Okay.
Nicole Kidman, huh?
Pam.
And Pamela Anderson, right? Both of them, Pamela Anderson, Nicole Kidman, how they're both like Pamela Anderson completely wiped away all of the facade, right? And is like, hey, I am aging. This is me. Look at me. I'm still beautiful. Nicole Kidman going, I was going to throw my career away and walk away because I felt like I was being aged out. And then has like recently has baby girl and had done a lot of things on Netflix. Yes.
I love that she did Baby Girl, by the way. Because this is something I think about actually very frequently, right? This, especially in relation to women, because I am one, around like, women being idealized in their youth. And then as we reach a certain age, we stop sort of being, attractive, desirable, whatever in general society. And so, yes, I love that Nicole Kidman did Baby Girl and has this like young, hot thing that's like, hello, right? Like, I'm
Hmm.
obsessed with you. And then I actually just the other day saw somebody pointing to the movie that either just came out or is about to come out, The Last Showgirl, which is
Oh yeah,
starring Pam
Pamela
Anderson.
Anderson.
And that and The Substance as being these two movies around like women aging and showing their age. And I think, The Last Showgirl probably does it differently than The Substance, obviously. But you're right. It is something that we're starting to see kind of come forward more and more, which I think is great.
Well, it's funny. I think about like in terms of Nicole Kidman, I obviously loved Moulin Rouge that came out in 2001, which I believe is around the time of the Venus retrograde in Aries. I think there was a Venus retrograde in Aries in 2001, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. But here we are now coming up on another Venus retrograde in Aries, and Nicole Kidman is having this kind of resurgence come up too.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting. I think film will definitely take a different approach. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more musicals that also come out in film.
Okay. I maybe maybe Wicked did
Hmm.
just come out, right?
Oh yeah, duh. Oh my God.
Yeah. So maybe
Duh.
that's paving the way, right, to more musicals. That's so funny. I do wonder, just aesthetically, right? Like what comes forward as being popular in fashion and beauty. Maybe we do see like that old Hollywood glamour, coming forward
Well,
again.
whatever the most recent award ceremony, Golden Globes, Hollywood glamour did dominate as a trend that people were seeing. And of course, not that celebrities set trends because fuck that narrative, but it is something that was being witnessed and kind of put in the forefront. I would say to I'd be interested to see what happens with style when the North Node and Saturn and Neptune are all really close together too. Because
So
I
that's what
tend
I was
to,
going to ask you about.
yeah, because I tend to attribute Neptune to like couture and like designers.
Makes sense.
Saturn being like the structure or the rules and regulations around garments too. And then like this North Node kind of straddling the two. I'd be curious if there's anything that we see come up around the environmentalism around the fashion industry, maybe new rules or regulations that come up, or dysregulation that comes up
Mhm.
too. So
Mhm.
when I talk about new rules, I'm not necessarily saying that they're going to be great either. So I want to like be clear there. Because like water consumption, and I think North Node and Pisces is a really big deal in the fashion industry. And like, the and maybe like some pushback happening in certain places that are losing water as a result of having like these factories or manufacturing or these fashion houses close by utilizing their water or their reserves. It'd be interesting to I was looking back at the Venus retrogrades and like some of the styles that were happening in the last Aries Venus retrogrades that also backtracked into Pisces, which is again still part of the nodal story. And low rise, cargo pants, metallics, state like every cycle there was a statement something. So it was like
Sure.
oversized belts, oversized hats, oversized sweaters. So to be curious to see like what becomes super and I already see it, but like what's becoming oversized now. I'm seeing like oversized pants mostly.
Mhm.
Or like
Mhm.
just oversized style becoming really big. For
Yeah.
me, footwear is something to watch
Yes, I agree.
because Pisces rules
Obviously.
the feet.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Also, I will say I just have felt very strongly that water is going to be this like huge theme
Mhm,
anyway.
mhm,
With the North Node in Pisces, I of course think about like the amount of water that AI uses, right? And
mhm,
that really coming forward as the big thing through climate change, where we see droughts, but we also see increasing severity of hurricanes and flooding and tsunamis
mhm,
and like all that stuff. I think water is just going to be this like huge, huge question in, oh my God, like so many industries. And maybe perhaps in like the true duality of Pisces, seeing where do we not have enough and where are we having an excess of it via floodings and blah, 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 right?
mhm.
Um, so that's interesting. But yeah, I agree with you. Footwear, totally through the North Node in Pisces. And yeah, we'll see what comes out, I guess, during Venus retrograde. But I agree with you about like oversized fashion. I see a lot of that kind of
Mhm.
coming forward again, which is funny because I really associate oversized fashion with like a Sagittarius.
Okay, but swimming in your clothes, Pisces,
True.
and
Yeah.
also shapeless, boundless, right? Not form-fitting,
Yeah, you're right.
flowy. Like these are all very Piscean. I do think metallics will be big
Yeah,
again in some way. I'm also trying to think about like what came about when Neptune entered Pisces
that was going to be my
because
question.
that was like the degendering of fashion became really big during those years because we're still in it. We're almost done with it. So I'd be curious to see how that boundary continues to be blurred. Taking a lot of inspiration from the ocean, mermaid hair, right? That was like a whole trend that
Thing, yeah.
happened. Yeah. So I'll be curious to see what comes up during this time, fashion
Yeah.
wise.
So, okay. So, on that note, we're obviously going to have a meeting of the North Node and South Node and Neptune, right? In early February, as we've sort of discussed. And so, what do you think about that?
My first thought was the Oscars. I think that doesn't that happen around then, around that time frame?
Probably.
Um, hold on. When are yeah, Oscars? LOL. It's March 2nd. But I
Okay.
think there's also another award ceremony that happens sometime in February, and I can't remember um in February. But I guess it doesn't matter. Um, but yes, the Oscars come to mind. So it'll be right after this period or kind of hovering around this period. So I would say pay attention to what's being worn or showing up in the Oscars because I think that's absolutely something that's going to mark a shift or a change. Um, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out myself how I feel about the North Node and Neptune very close together. Because the
Mhm.
last time North Node was in Pisces, Neptune was not
Yeah.
in Pisces. So this will be the first time that we will have experienced that in our lifetime, right?
Mhm.
And quite possibly the last, actually,
Yeah.
in
Yep.
Pisces. Yeah, we'll experience it in other signs, but the last time in Pisces that we'll experience that. It does make me think about when the South Node was conjunct Neptune. And that was what, 2007, 2016, I think, actually. It was 2016.
I'm not sure.
So trends of 2016 were, let's see, fashion trends. It looks like some of the big things were velvet, uh, backless shoes. Oh, the mule. Yes. Oh my God. I was such a big mule person. Still
Were you
am,
really?
actually. I loved a mule. So I definitely think that there's something to be said about their shoes, right? And like the backlessness being like the freedom to slip in and out of your shoes, but also
Mhm.
the amount of injuries that probably went up
Yeah.
uh, during mules being a big deal. Yeah, I don't know. I also think too, there was a rise of using, and this happens all the time, but I think there was a rise of making statements with your fashion during that time, especially because that was the year that Donald Trump got elected the first time, right? And
Yeah.
so there were a lot of like, you think about like, the pussy hats or like
Mm.
all of the t-shirts that came out that were like, pro-feminism or, gay rights or all the fat, like our fashion started to to become really political, and it usually is political. I want to be clear there, but there was an overtness
Mm.
about the politics of fashion. So I'll be curious to see how that comes up.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just think about like for me, that conjunction with the North Node and Neptune obviously really dominates like the front end of this transit, right? Like, they're in tight orb even right now, right? Throughout
Hmm.
all of January, throughout all of February, and I'm assuming a little bit of March as well. And so there's just something about that is kind of like a question mark for me. Um, Collectively, individually, right? Because at least on an individual level, like we've all been dealing with Neptune and Pisces transiting somewhere in our charts
Hmm.
for almost 14 years, right? And so now at like the very end of that transit, we kind of have this like weird pinnacle, this weird like karmic thing where the nodes are aspecting Neptune in a very strong way,
Hmm.
arguably the longest, right? A conjunction. So
I
yeah,
wonder if do we think it's like a shedding around some collective pain that can
maybe.
happen? I know that feels really big, but I'm thinking about like Neptune cleanses all it touches.
Mm-hmm.
I often feel that way about it as an outer planet. And so is there something being cleansed in the Neptune in the North Node in Pisces? And is there some sort of like collective pain or aggravation that we're trying to like walk away from or leave behind?
Mm-hmm.
I've often said that Saturn in Pisces is not like the Eight of Cups, right? Disappointment and knowing when to walk away and let go, knowing when to surrender, and how disappointment creates opportunities. I'd be curious to see how the North Node conjunct Saturn brings that into like
Mm-hmm.
reality in a
Exactly.
very like wow sort of way,
Mm-hmm.
um, before it has its send off, before Saturn has its send off into and Neptune into Aries.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the conjunction with Neptune and Saturn are definitely like two things I really have my eye on around the transiting nodes. Um, just because anytime anything is conjunct North Node, it's a big deal. So yeah,
Yeah, I think grief.
yeah,
Like Pisces often has that connection to me to grief because it's healing, because it's surrender, because it's compassion, because it's forgiveness. It's also grief.
yeah. I agree with you. And like, you've often talked about Saturn and Pisces pointing to like disappointment and how we deal with disappointment. And so perhaps there's like something there as well when the North Node is hanging out with
Hmm.
Saturn.
Hmm. And I think it goes back to also what you were saying, where people are gonna realize that they're not getting what they thought that they were getting, right? And the disappointment that they have or we have around some of that too.
I
There's
totally
something
agree.
about breaking illusion that I
Mhm.
think is right. And like some realities are gonna feel harsh
Yes,
during
I
this
agree.
time.
I completely agree.
So okay. Any other like final thoughts or things that you want to discuss or bring up before we close out our little time together?
No, I think that's it. I feel good about this. I feel like we covered some interesting ground.
I do too. I'm so grateful to have you here and be a part of this and for us to just kind of chat and speak up. So you have a lot going on, right? You have two
You're
projects in the
like,
world.
I'm going to do this. Okay.
Well, I know, but you have two projects already out in the world, right? Pluto Oracle and the Compendium. So, but you have one other one coming out this year. Is that true?
That is true. It's called Stellar Sex, Unlocking Your Birth Chart Through Erotic Astrology. That is going to be out in the world on July 8th, and I'm very
Mhm.
excited.
It's available for pre-order.
It's available for pre-order.
Oh my God, how
Um,
great.
Anthony, you're always very kind in promoting my stuff, and I appreciate it.
Of course. And then I think you have one other project that you're working on that's slated to come out 2026.
Yes, I don't know how much I'm really allowed to talk about that at this time, but
Okay.
I am under contract for another book that will come out at some point in 2026.
Yay.
Yay!
Yay. So excited. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for sharing your insights, and I adore you.
Okay, well, likewise on all friends. I love you.
Love you too.